Chapter 33. The skiff moved starboard and aft at 3 meters per second. It was as fast as Gunny dared to travel. The memory of the obstacle course on Mira's belly kept intruding on his mind. The thoughts made him weary and ready for a well-deserved, long-ass nap. Talby had called in. Somewhere above them, the SV-52s circled the hull so the lieutenant could keep an eye on Gunny and the Marines he'd left behind at the spindle. With Went in the gunner's chair, Gunny was reasonably sure he'd get a shout-out before he reached anything too obvious. Then again, this was Went. The Marine was experienced, but frequently seemed to overlook the most obvious things in the world. Gunny frowned. He shouldn't think that way. The man's attitude had definitely changed since Nero died. The fact his squad was missing probably didn't hurt either. A field of pine cones lay further aft, but the last mount point was more than a dozen meters away from it. Gunny was glad they weren't going that way. He didn't like the things, didn't trust them. Something about them was way off. And after that acid shit ate Nero, he'd never trust anything on Mira again.
Gunny to Talby.
Go ahead,
the lieutenant said.
On approach. I'm slowing the skiff and should be there in less than 2 minutes.
Understood,
Talby said.
Take your time, do it right.
Aye, sir,
Gunny said. Once again, the take your time phrase irked him. Both the captain and Talby had said those words implying, make sure you don't get anyone killed. He knew better, and they knew it too. Must be the stress of losing Nero. That wasn't much comfort. After cutting thrust to 1/3 meter per second, the skiff moved like a lazy fish toward the mount point target, its lights illuminating the empty zone Talby had talked about. The barren area was little more than a 10-meter circle with a deep crack bisecting it. The mount point lay just a few meters away from the circle's center and the trench. Gunny adjusted the skiff's attitude so he could approach the target from the aft side.
Shit,
he thought.
Guess I have to fly over the pine cones after all. Went. We have to go over a bunch of those pine cone things to get to the LZ. Keep a lookout for me.
Aye, Gunny,
Went said.
Might want to increase the hover.
Good idea,
Gunny said, scowling at the fact he hadn't thought of it himself. He lowered the magnetic force and the skiff raised in altitude to a meter above the hull. It was only twice what they'd normally travel at, but it would have to do. Any more than that, and the skiff might fly free of the hull and carry them off into space. Space. Right. He looked past the hull into the debris field floating further and further away from Mira.
And Talby flew through that shit?
He shook his head. He'd known the LT a long time and liked him, but he could be reckless with his own life. Never with the lives of his squads, mind you, but everything else just seemed to be another adventure for him. He returned his focus to the hull and guided the skiff into the massive field of pine cones. If he had his way, he'd fly over this shit as fast as he could. But if they were going to make the LZ, he didn't have that option. Maybe going slow was the right call anyway. He wouldn't have to worry about the thrusters disturbing the objects. Callimora's skiff had been covered with the things, probably from the magnetics. For all Gunny knew, that's why her skiff crashed.
Keep an eye on the skiff's hull, Gunny said.
Aye.
Through his rear cam, Gunny watched lean over the gunnel.
Nothing yet, Gunny.
That, at least, was something. The pinecone field around the final mount point was absolutely stuffed with the things. He could barely make out any gaps between them, as though they'd all cuddled up together from a possible threat. He shivered at the thought.
They're not alive, he told himself. Just strange shit from outside the solar system.
Mira. What else did this cursed ship bring back with it? A few micro-thruster bursts, and the skiff finally crossed the last of the pine cones and into the dead zone.
Went, you keep an eye on that trench over there. I mean, Gunny growled, keep the cannon pointed at it and pay attention.
After a second or two, Went finally spoke.
Okay. Gunny, you know something I don't?
Yeah, that you shouldn't trust this ship, Gunny said.
Copy,
Went said. The target for the mount point was little more than a few meters away.
How's the line?
I think we're good, Gunny,
said.
Can't guarantee we don't have it spread over some of the cones, but when the spindle takes up the slack, it should straighten out and avoid them.
Gunny cursed. He hadn't even thought about that. One reason he'd approached from this angle was to avoid having to fly over the trench Talby had seen. Now, he had to hope that when they tightened the line, it didn't get stuck on those things. He brought the skiff to a halt and steadied the mount point. Just a bare patch of outpost steel, nothing to be afraid of. But the trench was only a few meters away, and from this angle, he couldn't see what it contained.
Like, I want a nanoprobe hovering above that trench.
Like paused before answering in the affirmative.
And make sure you set its motion alarm.
Aye, Gunny.
Like said. His voice sounded tense, confused, and maybe a little afraid.
Is there something moving in there?
I don't know, Gunny snapped, which is why I want the fucking nanoprobe.
Copy, Gunny.
Like stuttered. A moment later, Gunny's HUD lit up with a nanoprobe alert. He connected to its feed, and a small window appeared before his eyes. The probe's camera showed a close-up view of the deck plate. The image was less than detailed, as the probe's insubstantial light barely illuminated the area. The motion sensor, however, should work fine. He hoped. Like flew the probe to the center of the trench and parked it a bare meter from the hull. Silvery liquid glistened at the bottom of the pit. A shudder of unease racked his spine. They were lucky Talby had spotted it first. If Gunny hadn't been warned, he probably would have dropped his Marines right into it.
Motion sensor activated.
Like said.
I set the radius to 2 meters. Should keep it from picking us up as false positives.
Gunny nodded in approval.
Good thinking, Like.
How do you want to do this, Gunny?
Wint asked.
Damned carefully,
he said. In truth, he didn't know how he wanted to do this. He brought a very experienced lance corporal and a private along for the job. While he trusted Went's magwalking and his ability to sniff out hazards, he didn't trust Like to use the cannon if something happened. Mounting the line into the outmost steel could be done by a single Marine, but would be faster with two. Gunny clenched his fists in indecision.
SFMC hates cowards,
he told himself.
Went, take the line gun. I want you on that cannon and to keep an eye on the probe's camera, such as it is. If we have to jump back in the skiff, I expect you to be at the controls in a heartbeat, understood?
Aye, Gunny.
Went said.
Like, you and I are going to place the last line.
Gunny waited for the Marine's response, but it didn't come.
Private Like, do you understand your orders?
Aye, Gunny.
The Marine finally said. He sounded terrified. Through the rear cam, Gunny saw Like's helmet pointed at the trench a few meters away.
Son, listen to me,
Gunny said.
If we both get out of the skiff and work together, we can place this thing in a few minutes and then get the fuck out of here. Went has our backs.
Yes, I do,
Went said. Gunny scowled beneath his visor. The last thing he needed was for Went to try and give the kid a pep talk, although he wondered if Went's words hadn't been aimed at Gunny instead.
So let's get this done, Private.
Aye, Gunny,
Like said. Standing from the pilot's chair wasn't easy. Gunny's legs were shaking, and it took him a moment to regain control. Like had seen the silvery liquid devour his squad mate's leg and ultimately kill Nero. He was sure the man's mind was filled with those images, not to mention the gurgling, panicked screams Nero loosed through the comms while he was slowly eaten alive. Gunny had the same problem. When he felt he had control of himself, he stepped out of the skiff on the side facing away from the trench and magwalked to the rear. Like awkwardly stepped from the gunwale to the deck, nearly losing his footing as he struggled to place both feet firmly on the hull. Gunny opened his mouth to yell at the private, correct the terrible dismount and magwalk technique, but decided against it. The boy didn't need any more stress than he was already dealing with. Like waited for Gunny to pass him and lead him to the line secured at the skiff's rear.
Gunny to Talby, over.
The lieutenant responded immediately.
Go ahead, Gunny.
Sir, Private Like and I are getting ready to place the last line.
There was a pause.
Understood, Gunny. I'm finishing my circle. Should be above you in 30 seconds.
Understood, sir. Out.
Gunny stared at the harness line. This was the last one, the very last mount point and last line. After this, they could haul ass back to S&R Black, get a breather, and then attach the harness to Black. They'd make it with time to spare, so long as the harness didn't give them much trouble during the hookup. If it did, well, they would deal with it. They always did.
Okay, Like,
he said.
I'm going to detach the line. Take hold of it about 3 meters from the skiff. When I let loose, the slack is going to float like a whip.
Aye, Gunny.
He waited until Like was in position with his hands maglocked to the spindle line.
On 3.
He counted down to 0 and detached the line. The short slack between the skiff and Like sprang up from the loss of tension, slapped the deck, and rose again before losing most of its momentum. Gunny grinned. Like was holding the line as though his life depended on it. The kid was scared, but he seemed even more terrified of disappointing his commanding NCO.
Just as it should be.
Gunny stood and turned to face Like.
See the target on your HUD?
Yes, Gunny.
Like said.
Well, get your ass to it. I'm going to walk down the line and make sure it's not caught on anything.
Aye.
The private said. Gunny watched him for a moment to make sure the kid didn't freeze up. Like hesitated and then walked forward, his helmet swinging from side to side as he looked for possible threats. Maybe the kid wasn't worthless after all. He closed his glove around the line just enough to use it as a guide. As opposed to his inexperienced Marines, Gunny mag-walked elegantly and fluidly. His eyes flicked from window to window on his HUD, scanning the area before him, around him, as well as behind him. He fought the urge to add Like's helmet feed to the already cluttered interface. That was a bad idea. He had to trust Went to help the kid. More than that, he needed to trust that Like had some balls. Each step further from the skiff brought him closer to the seemingly never-ending field of pine cones. When they first approached this area of Mira, he thought their number was in the hundreds. He'd been way off. It was much closer to thousands. In some places on the hull, they were packed in clusters 4 or 5 deep. Talby had somehow missed this on his scouting passes with the 52? He had a hard time believing that. But if Talby hadn't missed them, then they must have, moved here when no one was looking? He shivered inside the warm suit. Migration was the word that kept echoing in his mind. Animals migrated to avoid unpleasant conditions.
Or danger,
he said aloud. Humans migrated for much the same reasons. If Mira were alive, he'd torture the bitch until she coughed up all her secrets about where she had been and, more importantly, just what the hell she brought back with her. But after all he'd seen, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. He'd rather the derelict just vaporize without a trace, taking everything it had seen with it. After walking 10 meters, lost in his thoughts, he finally stopped. The line was clean. Their tow hadn't resulted in it getting stuck to the pine cones or wrapping around them. Once the harness line tightened for flight, it would more than likely cut through any obstacle it encountered. He hoped.
Like, what's your status?
The boy sounded out of breath when he spoke.
Almost finished, Gunny. We should go green in a minute or two.
Gunny's lips twitched toward a grin.
Good. Went?
Clear so far, Gunny, I think.
Went's voice broke off. A cold chill filled his stomach.
Went? Gunny said. Give me status, now.
I'm getting alerts from the probe, Gunny.
Went said. Cursing, Gunny turned around and headed to Like and the mount point. He added the probe's feed to his interface and opened his mouth wide. The glistening liquid in the trench shimmered and bubbled.
Gunny to Talby.
Talby here, what's up?
Sir, we may need an evac,
Gunny said. 4 meters separated him from Like.
That trench is doing something.
Shit,
Talby said.
I'm dropping altitude. I'll stay 10 meters above the skiff. I'm ready with the line.
Very good, sir.
Gunny's words came out clipped and rushed. Just knowing Talby was up there made him feel a little better. A little.
Green!
Like said. A nanosecond later, and Gunny's HUD reported the same line status.
Get in the fucking skiff, now!
Gunny yelled. He dropped the line and changed direction.
Went, now would be a good time to become a pilot.
Aye, Gunny.
Went said. He saw the large Marine scrambling from the mounted cannon to the pilot chair. 3 meters. 2. Like's slow, awkward steps had grown even worse with the stress. If the kid didn't calm down, he might really fuck up and end up floating off the hull. No time to worry about that. Went had the line gun. He reached the skiff and climbed aboard. Like was a little more than 2 meters away on the other side. Gunny pulled himself to the opposite gunwale with his mag gloves and extended his arms over the side, hand open. Like reached for it. His glove locked with Gunny's. He plucked the young Marine from the hull.
Went, now!
The skiff came to life beneath his boots. A vibration rocked the vehicle as Went rotated the skiff using the thrusters. Before the skiff could turn back to face the trench, Went punched the thrusters again, and they started moving away from the area at 5 meters per second. Like floated above the skiff. Gunny pulled him down into the craft and locked him to a tether. He slapped the Marine on the shoulder.
Good job, Like.
Holy shit!
Like said, his helmet facing behind them. Gunny flipped to the skiff's rear camera. The entire field of pine cones stirred, squirming like maggots in a festering wound. A few floated off the hull, undulating in the darkness with alien elegance. A silvery geyser erupted from the trench. Dozens of the pinecone objects seemed to leap off the hull. The geyser spewed higher. Something was coming out of the trench.